Welcome to YogiViews, where my guest is yoga itself, through interviewing those who practice it, teach it, sell it, or simply love it. I am Antonio Saucis. Yoga is a 6,000-year-old tradition that has reached global popularity in latest years. Though generally associated with India, dedicated spiritual masters have passed it from one generation to the next at different times in history and in different parts of the world. Jesus Christ, one of the most revered masters of all times, may have very strong yogic roots, and many find his teachings just another expression of the knowledge of yoga. To speak about Jesus' yogic nature, I invited today Dharmadas and Nirmala. Welcome.
Thank you.
Dharmadas and Nirmala are the spiritual directors of Ananda Sacramento, a yoga community and teaching center in the Rancho Cordova area of Sacramento. They bring the experience of nearly 40 years of meditation, yoga, spiritual living, and practice to their teaching in North America, Europe, Asia, and India. Both raised as Christians, they have studied, taught, and worked with the teachings of Jesus from a mystical and yogic standpoint. In addition, they are both musicians who find joy in sharing spiritual teachings and inspiration through music. The center in Sacramento is part of Ananda, a global movement founded in 1968 by Swami Kriyananda based on the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda. I'd like to ask you both the questions that opens the show usually, and that is, how was your first experience in yoga? When did you first meet yoga?
I would say I met yoga before I really knew meditation. I knew the physical part of yoga a little bit, which is to say that I had practiced for 2 or 3 months yoga postures, fairly seriously, but on my own without a teacher. And my first experience of yoga came, I would say, in a deep inward experience while I was reading a book. I happened to be reading Swami Kriyananda's autobiography called The Path, and it spoke to me very deeply. He was asking questions about life, questions about the spiritual principles of life, and I felt incredible peace in the reading of that. And in fact, stopped breathing, which was rather a novel experience for me. I had never gone breathless before. I had held my breath, but I'd never gone breathless. They're very different. And but I will also say that the physical practice of yoga had given me great results as well. I was doing hatha yoga for 2 hours each day and experiencing a great deal of joy and peace in that practice and in that process. But it's still, at this time, I knew nothing about meditation, and I held that as a goal for the future. I really wanted to learn meditation and deepen my practice of it. So that was when I was 19.
Wow.
And I was in college.
How long after you were able to get in touch with meditation?
It came later that same year. So before I was 20, I had learned. And I took, in our tradition, Kriya Yoga is the main initiation, the main technique that we practice, and I took that initiation just after I turned 20. So it was just right after.
You'll tell us about that practice in a minute. What about you, Nirmala?
Well, I was in college, and my mother told me about yoga. And I got a book and started practicing and tried to stand on my head and do all those things. Then after some time, maybe later that year, I came across an article that said yoga, a community based on yoga principles. And the idea of living in a place where everyone practiced yoga was so thrilling that I went directly there, and that was almost 40 years ago. And it was in the Ananda community that I learned about meditation. And so though I had been doing the physical hatha yoga, it was the Raja Yoga, the philosophy, that was most important to me.
And that first community was the Ananda community?
Yes,
Wow, so you
Yes.
stayed true to
the whole time.
an old school yogi.
Yes.
Because in modern days, people go from one style to the other, or from one guru to the other, and in ancient times, or just a few years back, you were asked to stay with one path.
Well, a friend had shown me Autobiography of a Yogi, but I couldn't read it at that time. So I kept practicing yoga, and then when I got to Ananda, the first thing that happened was someone gave me Autobiography of a Yogi. So I said, this master is chasing me.
And so tell me a little bit about Ananda and Swami Kriyananda and his relationship to Paramahansa.
Swami Kriyananda was a very close disciple, not in terms of years so much, because he was with Yogananda for the last 3.5 years of Yogananda's life, but in terms of connection and in terms of developing Yogananda's work, because he was trained by Yogananda to teach, which is a little bit different from, there were other disciples who were close to Yogananda and who spent many more years with him, but they weren't very many of them trained to bring this out to the world. And so Swamiji's gift was to take this literally all over the world, you know, from India to all over Europe to all over the Americas, bringing it to people in multiple languages. He lectured in 5 languages, so he could take this to people in their own way. He spoke Spanish, he spoke Italian, French, German, later on Bengali and a little bit of Hindi, and he was able to address people where they were. And Yogananda's work with him, in particular bringing these things to India, which sounds very odd. Why would these teachings go back to India? In fact, an entire book was written about that. Reverse spirituality, where it comes back to the place of its origin. And we were very much a part of that, living in India nearly 9 years and teaching all over India ourselves. But Yogananda, part of his mission was to bring East and West together. Obviously, continuing a tradition that Vivekananda had begun in a way when he came. But there is so much depth of spirituality, obviously, in India, and there is tremendous spirituality in the West, but we don't think of it so much. But those two needed to come together and create balance and harmony. And so part of Swami's role was to create the communities that Nirmala was responding to, or was relating a moment ago, which are places where people can practice these things and live them and support each other. And it's a huge help to be able to do this. As you would know, teaching yoga, it helps to have people around you, helps to have support.
Absolutely.
And in daily life, that's an enormous help. We've lived all over the world, but a number of times we've lived in places where we didn't know our neighbors and where our neighbors were not necessarily interested in anything spiritual. And yeah, we can navigate through life like that, but it's so wonderful to know not only who your neighbors are, but to have long, ongoing friendships with them for decades, and to watch their spiritual growth and life unfold. It's a beautiful thing. So it's been a huge help in our lives to be able to do that.
Now, when I was presenting you, introducing you, I referred to you as Christians, as you were brought up as Christians. So tell me a bit about that.
Well, I grew up Catholic, and I remember that I very much loved the saints. I used to collect their pictures and read books about them, and I loved that they were like superheroes. They could do all kinds of things. They could levitate, or they could be in 2 places at once, or they could resurrect the dead. They could do so many miraculous things. So in studying yoga, in reading Autobiography of a Yogi, one understands that the miraculous is still under natural law, but it's just a higher law. It's not the mundane that most people know, but it's an elevated law. And we can all be part of that. As Jesus said, don't you know that you are gods? And you can do greater than this, than what I've done. You can do many, many things. So that aspiration is very important for people to understand, that we're not kept down, we're not underneath all the mundane realities. We can ascend back to where Jesus came from.
I was raised in the Lutheran tradition and was extremely devoted to it. At the age of 11 or 12 or 13, I was determined to become a Lutheran minister. My friends looked at me like I was crazy. They also looked at me like with amazement that I could possibly know what I wanted to do at that age. How could that be? Nobody knew what they wanted to do at the age of 12, except maybe be a sports hero or something. But I loved the tradition. There was a real heartfelt connection for me. The music, I loved the music. I remember our church installed a pipe organ when I was about 8 or 9 years old. And once that thing was installed, the guy came from Germany to install it, and the church, the floor rumbled. I mean, it's like the whole church vibrated. I mean, I would just go off. I mean, it was amazing hearing that music and singing it. So for me, there was a very devotional connection. I really, really tried to experience Christianity the way my tradition brought it to me. But as a teenager, I started asking inconvenient questions. And, and they, I had a good friend who was Jewish. What was going to happen to him after he died? All sorts of things that can't easily be answered really by anybody. I mean, to be fair.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I wasn't getting answers that satisfied me. And so I kept looking. I also just had this really strong intuitive sense that someday, somewhere, there's a higher potential than just what I'm getting in this expression. I loved being with the people. I loved the spiritual tradition, the way I understood it. But I remember even in 7th grade, so I was maybe 11, 12, something like that, I remember I was going through the confirmation process with our church, and the pastor, who I loved, he was a wonderful guy, wonderful soul, but I remember him saying at one point, well, now you know that we believe that we have the right understanding of the Bible. Our interpretation is the right one. And I just remember this little red warning light went off in my brain, and it was like, how can you be so sure? How do you know that anyway? And it was a reality. It was just a little placeholder back there. It wasn't a big deal, but the question never quite went away. And I just kept asking. And for me, coming into the practice of yoga, the study, the experience of yoga as it came to me, and the teachings that Yogananda brought to the West, where he helped join original yoga and original Christianity as teachings of Jesus, I could really experience on a deeper level. There is yoga in the Bible. It's all through the thing. You have to look for it. You have to see it. It may not, that may ruffle people's feathers. Certainly in my tradition it would have. In fact, when I was between age 8 and maybe 15, if somebody had said that to me, I would have challenged them.
Yep.
Absolutely,
and
with vigor. In fact, I remember an uncle of mine who was part of a spiritual tradition from India. I was reading the Bible, and he came in and he saw that, and he said, "Oh, it's a good book." And I said, wait a minute. It's a good book, or it's the good book? He said, both. And well, it was like, come on, don't give me this a good book stuff. But I was very dedicated and very serious about it. But he helped, and others helped me. The yoga tradition just helped me to broaden. You know, it's like I had
the blinders
take
off.
the blinders off, widen the view, widen the perspective. There's a big reality. Doesn't mean you don't aim at the goal, but there's a deep truth in each one has to follow in his own way. There are as many different kinds of Christians as there are Christians.
Yeah.
And each one has to find his own way of understanding those teachings.
Yeah. So, Jesus Christ. Same, Jesus Christ, different?
That's a good, challenging question.
Jesus referred to himself when he was talking about his human body as the Son of Man. And when he referred to his soul, unencumbered by the body, his soul that was one with the Father, then he was the Son of God. So we think of Jesus as the name of the man, but Christ as the Christ consciousness, as that Spirit of God that permeates all of creation, that created everything.
There's a very deep and a very mystical tradition that this comes out of, and this is something that Yogananda brought and explained. But he was saying Christ is a title, it's not a last name. Interestingly, Krishna had the same, Yadava Krishna, the manifestation of this consciousness. But what is that consciousness? There's a stillness, there's a still point in creation. Nowadays we can talk about energy in ways that hundreds of years ago we couldn't really talk about. The language of it wasn't there. Prana, the concept of energy, always related to breath. Pranayam, control of breath. Well, now we know it's control of energy. So atoms whirling around, there's a still point at the center, at the heart of every atom. There's a still point at the heart of every being. Experience that, you're experiencing Christ. Christ lives literally in every atom of creation. And literally, of course, by extension in each one of us. So to identify that with a person, to limit that to a person, well, he carried that consciousness. That's why wise men from the East came to honor him. They knew that that spirit was fully manifest in this soul. They could follow a star. This is very interesting. They could follow a star in the East and go west. Which is fascinating
Yeah,
when you
you're
put
right.
that together. And it doesn't mean that they walked backwards for hundreds of miles. It means they were following a star here. They were following a star on the inside. I remember as a child going to the planetarium and seeing the program about the star in the East. And they're trying to figure out, was it a comet? Was it this? Was it that? How could it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, you can't quite find it astronomically. But that tradition, he was connected with that tradition from those times. And they made a visit all the way, were able to find him, locate him, connect with him, and that played out later on as time goes forward.
If Jesus was a yogi, what was the yoga Jesus taught?
His yoga is in the Bible. You know, it's a little, when we use the term yoga, as you've mentioned, often people think of it as physical only. It's this posture, and it's this posture, and it's this sequence of things that you do physically for the most part. But there's a deeper tradition, and that tradition is, how do you find peace? How do you find stillness? How do you make the connection with God? And that's the kind of yoga that Jesus taught. Now, did he teach it to everyone? No. Is it easily found in the Bible? It can be found, but it's like, for example, when he says, love the Lord with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, and with all your strength. That's pure yoga. With all your strength. He doesn't mean muscle power.
Yeah.
He means energy. If you're going to put all your energy, how do you love anybody with all your heart? you have to have your heart. You have to be able to give your heart to someone or something to be able to do that. That's a tremendous commitment. So it's there in the teaching when he says, if thine eye be single, thy whole body shall be filled with light. Well, here again, we have yoga, but it's not the typical physical kind that we think of when we normally would parlance talk of yoga. So it's there. But
especially in John, in
Yeah.
the Revelation of John. He talks about the chakras. He calls them the 7 candlesticks, the 7 churches, the 7 seals. So there's a lot of yoga there.
the river moving, these things represent very deep inward realities, the currents of energy. This is what the tradition of Kriya Yoga touches on as well. Yogananda, in his autobiography of a yogi, touches on this briefly, and he says, Jesus taught Kriya or a similar technique to his disciples by way of helping them to have the experience of these deeper realities. And I've always loved that. He taught them this technique or a similar technique because they all head in the same direction, but the teacher has to adjust according to the age, the culture, the location, even the climate.
Yeah.
All of these things play into it, and so he has to use the language that people can relate to in the place that he's working. Yogananda came to the West in the 20s. He had a hard time speaking of yoga here in America, very materialistic world. He described the consciousness of Americans in the 1930s as us 4 and no more. Mom, dad, 2 kids. He didn't like that consciousness. He loved America generally. He loved the get up and go spirit, the make it happen kind of spirit, but he didn't like that sort of narrowed down. Yoga was a new concept for Americans. He was just breaking into a whole new world.
Yeah, yeah. Now, if we think about the big branches of yoga, bhakti yoga, karma yoga, could you classify Jesus as a yogi according to one of those, or to many, or?
I think he was a great yogi in bhakti, jnana, karma, everything. Raja yoga, he was exemplary in all those things. He taught so much service, giving to the poor. He was the perfect karma yogi, and he was the perfect bhakti,
Yes.
obviously, and
Christ's heart.
jnana too.
Yeah, his explanations of the universe, the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. I mean, all of that is also yogic tradition. It's mystical. It's very deep. It's very profound. It's not the easily, stretch your leg out and bring your head down towards your knee. I mean, it's not on that level. It's pretty rich stuff.
Yeah.
But it's there. Yeah, I would have to say he was all of them in a way, all of them combined. Raja perhaps on the deepest level. We don't hear much of, at least in the Bible, we don't hear much of Jesus talking in terms of physical yoga or physical techniques. But he had a wonderful sense of humor, and when the Pharisees were complaining about his disciples not washing their hands on the Sabbath properly, he would say, well, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. I mean, he had a spicy sense of relating to people at the level they needed to hear it, and sometimes he could be pretty strong.
Yeah, very strong, yeah. Now, some of those teachings are still relevant today. Would you agree with that?
Very much.
Absolutely.
Very much so, yeah. Yeah, those traditions are timeless, ageless, cultureless even in a sense, because they have to be able to apply to people wherever they may be. I remember before we lived in India, questioning why so many yogic traditions talk about keeping the body cool, cooling the body. Well, then we lived in India, and then we understood very well because it's darn hot over there. And if you're going to do anything, you better learn. They didn't, have air conditioning in those days, particularly not in the way that we think of it. So yeah, you had to adjust. You had to work with things as they were.
So I would like to know if you would gift us with a song.
Happily.
If you could
I'd
do
be
that.
happy
Happily.
to do that.
Then let's get ourselves set for that.
Thank you. So this song is called Looking for a Friend, and it is a Christmas song about Jesus at the time of his birth, and it's written by Swami Kriyananda. Where are you going, my little one? In hope these empty streets I went. I've seen a star rise in the east, and I'm looking for a friend. Where are you going, good shepherd folk? From a lowly valley we ascend. A wondrous vision sent us here. We're looking for a friend. You learned men, where are you going? Our souls the long journey we would end. Therefore we've come to Bethlehem. We're looking for a friend.
This concludes the first part of a two-part show where I'm interviewing Dharmadas and Nirmala from Ananda, Sacramento. They are spiritual directors of Ananda, Sacramento, a yoga community and teaching center in the Rancho Cordova area of Sacramento. They bring the experience of nearly 40 years of meditation, yoga, spiritual living, and practice to their teaching in North America, Europe, Asia, and India. Both raised as Christians, they've studied, taught, and worked with the teachings of Jesus from a mystical and yogic standpoint. In addition, they are both musicians who find joy in sharing spiritual teachings and inspiration through music. The center in Sacramento is part of Ananda, a global movement founded in 1968 by Swami Kriyananda, based on the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda. I hope you liked our show today. And if you care to let me know, shoot me an email at antonio@yogiviews.com. I look forward to seeing you the next time.